Welcome to day 2 of the symposium 50 Years of Project Tiger, Conservation Conflict Treaty. We had 2 excellent sessions titled Politics and Markets and Bureaucracy and Community on day 1. Next is the 3rd session of the symposium titled Reenchanting the Sundarbans with Anu Jales and Meghna Mehta. Anu Jales is an environmental anthropologist and associate professor of anthropology at Creer University. She works on the human-animal interface, environmental justice, religious identity, gender, caste, and migration. Anu is the author of the brilliant Forest of Tigers, People, Politics, and Environment in the Sundarbans, published by Routledge in 2010, and co-author of The Bengal Diaspora, Rethinking Muslim Migration, also published by Routledge in 2016. With Joya Chatterjee and Claire Alexander. Our second speaker of the day, Meghna Mehta, is a social environmental anthropologist and lecturer in social anthropology at University College London at the Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction. Her research straddles global conservation, political ecology, and the environmental humanities, with a particular focus on values, methodologies, and ideas of sufficiency. She is currently at work on a book manuscript titled Conserving Life, Political Imaginaries from a Submerging Forest, based on long-term ethnographic fieldwork in the mangrove forests of the Sundarbans located in the Bengal Delta. Responding to their papers today will be Dominic O'Kee. Dominic is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Sheffield and the author of Creaturely Forms in Contemporary Literature, Narrating the War Against Animals, published by Bloomsbury in 2022. His research spans contemporary literature, post-colonial studies, and the environmental humanities. And he is currently writing a book titled Conservation Plot that investigates the relationship between post-colonial literature and wildlife conservation. Before I invite Anu to start her presentation, I would just like to mention that we will be keeping the videos and audio of all the audience muted for the duration of the conversations, of the talks, and the chat function will also be disabled so as not to disturb the speakers. Once they are done with their papers and the Q&A starts, we will enable these functions and you can raise a hand to let us know that you have a question. So over to you, Anu, and thank you so much for making it today in spite of what's going on in Chennai after the cyclone. We know that it hasn't been easy, and we are very grateful that you're here.
Thank you so much, Anu. I'm so glad to be able to do this. I hope it all works. I will be sharing my screen. Somehow Zoom has changed a bit. Hang on. Okay, share screen. Yes. Oh, can I share screen?
Yes, you are co-host, so you'll have the option.
Okay, great. Share. Done. So good afternoon. Oops. I'm really glad to be able to do this. I was initially going to speak only on the tiger charmers of the Sundarban. And then I thought that I could maybe open this up and talk about my new work. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of what I'm doing. And as I get it, it's half an hour, right? I have half an hour, or I have
Yes, that's correct. You have half an hour, 30 minutes.
Great. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Let me start. So as you all know, I did my fieldwork in the Sundarban. It was in '99. And before that, I had been there as a high school student. And I have always been very interested by this region. And what interested me right from the beginning was how people kept telling me that I needed to go to the forest and basically know more about tigers to be able to write about the people. And that's how I got interested in tigers in the first place. It wasn't as if I had gone to the this region, the South 24 Parganas, the Sundarban region, with any intention really of working on the wildlife, strangely enough. So it was really because people kept saying that I needed to look at that I got interested. And at the same time, there was Philippe Descola, who was at the London School of Economics, where I was doing my PhD, and he had just come out with his book on nature, culture, spheres of twilight, where he talks about the Amazon and how people completely identified with jaguars in the place where he had done field work. And he said that we had to rethink how people understand animals. And he had said that there are many ways of understanding non-humans or animals. One of it, and I'm not going to talk about the 4 ways in which he sort of elaborated how we understand animals. He had said that basically the 2 big different ways were what he called naturalism versus animism. There was also totemism and analogism, but what interested me was how naturalism was a way of understanding the natural world in relation to Western ideas of classification, where you understood animals as somehow similar in body, but different in thought. Whereas in animism, you saw animals as similar in thought. So basically, a jaguar could dream, a jaguar could have mood changes, a jaguar could be kind or whatever. And in the the way people spoke about tigers reminded me a lot of this understanding of what I started to call the non-human and not animal. So where people said, tigers are fine, they basically protect us as much as we protect them. They didn't see themselves as being in some way superior to, forest animals. They saw them as other beings that were just as powerful as certain humans in the village. So that opened up a big world of understanding the non-human. And there was this very interesting story on how Allah had sent a young woman called Bon Bibi to basically protect humans from tigers. And in the end of the story, Bon Bibi had ended up adopting both the tiger as well as the little human as her children. And via this adoption, she had somehow created a link of kinship between the 2 categories of beings. And so people often said, we can go to the forest and we're safe in the forest if we go there with empty hands and pure hearts. And those were explained as not being a violent person, being somebody who is calm, not having debts, not having any plot of land, not having a job. So so empty hands meant not having other ways of making a living. So you were going to the forest as a last recourse, and then you would be safe. And pure-hearted means that you didn't go there with firearms, and you didn't want to take more than you should. And I once went with them, and strangely enough, when we came back, I was given an equal amount of some dry firewood we had brought back, and I had done very little, understandably. And they said, no, that's how it is. We have to equally divide whatever we bring back from the forest. And if at that point somebody said, can I get some of your wood, they would be forced to give it to them. Similarly with the catch they brought back from the forest. So if somebody said, wow, what a nice fish, you usually gave that fish, because otherwise it would there was not only the idea of najor or nazar or the evil eye, but also the idea that you were basically taking from the forest, and it wasn't for you to sell. So you could also give away what you had brought back, because it was given, it was a free gift which you could pass on. So it was all these ways of being around the Sundarban really fascinated me and got me interested in this whole world of the non-human and how people in various parts of the world interact with the non-human. So, so this is this famous superpower I was talking about, Bon Bibi. The Hindus consider her a goddess. The Muslims consider her as some kind of energy or power. They say that she has the same energy as, for example, Sufi saints who are buried in certain dargahs or shrines, and that they show her the kind of veneration they would, those Sufi saints or their parents. So it wasn't really a worship of Bon Bibi, but a kind of veneration. And I found that distinction quite interesting. This was as much in Bangladesh as well as in West Bengal. So they said, no, we don't worship her. We call for her power, for her blessings, for her power, the way we would our saints or the way we would our parents. So this is very interesting. These are some representations of Bon Bibi in the Hindu context, even though the painting was made by a Potua artist. And as you know, Potua artists are people who are on the margins of society. Very often, they are Muslim, but they sing and narrate stories, Hindu stories, and they are they have very often a Muslim name as well as a Hindu name. So these artists are not at all in the Sundarban area. They're more around Midnapur. But one of the artists got interested in this story and drew this the few Potua paintings that you see in this presentation. She is completely vegetarian. She's offered fruits and some sweets and live chicks. So this is, for example, a shrine in Bangladesh where she's offered live chicks. In West Bengal too, when people go to the forest for her worship or veneration, they offer these live chicks because they believe that she protects against tigers because she sees tigers as her children, like she does humans, and that she brought a certain kind of truce between them and humans. And as long as humans respect the rules of the forest, they can be safe. So, a small recap for me, it was, unlearning what I thought an animal was, and to start understanding what an animal or a non-human was from the Sundarban Islanders' point of view. And so how that non-human was vulnerable to tiger charmers, and tiger charmers were like tigers. So in a way, they knew the language of tigers, and tigers knew the language of tiger charmers. And this was why very often they even had some sort of exchange of spells and words, and they would, tigers would appear in dreams of tiger charmers, and it was very often seen as some sort of big ego fights between tigers and tiger charmers. And also the tiger was seen as, like humans, succumbing to ideas of greed, and this was why he had turned man-eater. And strangely enough, the Sundarban is perhaps the only place where tigers have been known to track humans and attack them. So they've been known to fly, to swim over into inhabited spaces, into villages, take people and swim back with them. At night, when the boats are in the rivers, sometimes they swim over and take a person and go back. So it is it is a very powerful swimmer, and it is strangely an animal that seeks out human flesh. Less so now because the place has a lot more motorboats and noise and all of that. But in the 80s, when I went there as a high school student, I remember a lot of scientists wondering why it was that tigers in this region were man-eaters. And so they said perhaps because the water is so brackish, or it was because of the tides and how in other places tigers mark their territories with their urine, but they couldn't do so in the Sundarban because twice a day that territory was washed away by tidal water. So in those days, they had started building, freshwater ponds. They had even put gur, jaggery in some places because they believed that would sweeten the tiger's nature. They had put electrified dummies, and they had distributed masks to people, telling them that they should wear them at the back of their heads because tigers were known to attack from the back. So this was, so I had gone there. I was in class 8, I think, and everybody was. They kept saying that people are refusing to wear masks because they're so superstitious and they believe in this goddess called Bon Bibi. And I remember going to the forest guards and saying, I'd like to wear one, with a friend of mine. We'd like to wear them. We are not superstitious. We'll go to the forest with these masks on. And the guards laughing at us and saying, these masks are only for the islanders. They're for the villagers here. They're not for you. And so again, me wondering why it was that I couldn't wear one and go to the forest. So this whole idea, of the tiger charmer and how they control these animals was, they were figures that were mocked in the gazetteer writers, by the gazetteer writers, and in gazetteer writings that I found on Lower Bengal. They were figures that were mocked by the forest officials. And this was why I wanted to go to the Sundarban and find out what they had to say about themselves, And they said, yes, of course, we're the first ones to be killed by tigers because we are in some sort, we become like tigers, and we know that tigers don't like other powerful tigers and are going to attack other powerful tigers. So when we go to the forest, we in a way try and make the place safe for everybody else. But when we get off, well, some tiger may be lurking there and they attack us. And they do so because they see us as so strong and powerful. So, as I said, this was my introduction to that whole realm of the forest and of tigers. And so it also became a way for me to understand literally what the islanders, thought about each other. Because they kept saying, you cannot write about us if you don't understand our tigers. And in a way, the scholar says that the way in which people talk about animals and the natural world is a reflection of how they think about other humans, about other people. And so it became an interesting way of looking at people. And for example, in naturalism, where you classify everything and where you think you can protect wild animals and that it's your duty to do so, you invariably think you're superior to other humans. And colonialism, right? That's basically the way the scholars saw it and explained it, the end result of naturalism. Whereas in animism, you don't think you're superior, and you don't think you're superior to other humans. You just think that you're, different categories of living creatures, and you have to learn how to cohabit, and that this was what living in certain spaces was about, but not just in places where you had wild animals, but also with other humans, right? So it said something about the kind of people, we are and we were. So I got interested in Bengal's Islamic past because of this story of Bon Bibi, where she is sent by Allah to save people from tigers. And I came across many shrines. This is one of the shrines that I found of hers. There are other shrines that I found which are enclosed little shrines with just mounds of earth inside. And this was probably how Bon Bibi was represented 200 years ago when her story started being written down. And she was perhaps later converted into a Hindu goddess. We don't really know. And her book, written in Bengali, which is written like English, starts from what we would call the end. So you have the book starting on what we say is the last page, to emulate Arabic. So again, this is very interesting. What happened was when I got a job in Singapore and I worked there for nearly a decade, I came across many stories of peers with tigers in Southeast Asia, just as I had in Bengal and in other parts of northern India. And so I decided to follow that trope. And so these are some images from 99. So I decided to follow that trope and see how people understood tigers in that part of the world. And what really fascinated me were some of the paintings I found, which were from the 10th century and the Dunhuang caves in China. What I wanted to say was that this close relationship, before I move on to that, close relationship to non-humans is not just within within the Hindu realm. All across Bengal, you have famous shrines which have water bodies associated with them. And usually that water is sacred, or you have sacred fishes inside. Here, this is a shrine in Chittagong where the turtles are extinct everywhere else. These are soft-shelled turtles, and they still exist in this big pond. And they are fed by people, and people caress their heads for blessings. So it is, and in other places you have crocodiles, a little bit like you have a water body linked to a temple. In the same way, you have these water bodies linked to Islamic shrines, and these are very sacred and very important places. So this is something I would say shared by many religions and cultures within South Asia, this very interesting kind of relationship with the non-human. So very quickly now, so on the left, you can see an image from Southeast Asia, from Malaysia. Above, it's an image from Iran. And the two pictures on the right are paintings from the 10th century, 9th century Dunhuang caves. Yeah, so I found there are about a dozen of these paintings. And it got me interested in how the tiger was perceived and what people thought of it in ancient China. So it was sort of seen as an agent between the living and the dead very early on. And it was represented. It's often paired with the dragon for rainmaking. But what is interesting is that these paintings from Dunhuang, here you can see in the middle of this map, are perhaps different from the way in which the tiger is represented in other parts of China. And I wonder to what extent it might not be a certain a certain association with Sufi holy men, because these are from the 9th and 10th century. They are from a place you can see up north here, Dunhuang and Turfan. This is where all the Uyghurs are in China, mainly, and most of the Uyghurs are from that region. And it is perhaps linked to the arrival of Islam in that part of the world. This is the tiger's current and historic range. You don't have many tigers in that part of China. However, you have these paintings. So this is another one. Again, this is late 9th century. You see the tiger, you see the Buddha on top, and you see men that don't look like Buddhist monks. And even though a lot of Chinese art historians have termed these men as monks, they look more like people who perhaps were healers, and they all have this huge big bag behind them, and they have sometimes little bottles dangling out of their bags. And again, every time you see them with a tiger, and you see men that don't look very much like Chinese luohans or saintly men. So I find that very interesting. You see the little bottles on the side of the bag. You see the kind of smoke coming out. Here you don't see any Buddha on the side. And you see, strangely, this tiger accompanying these men. So in rural Bengal, you find a lot of stories of peers with tigers, but you don't have any visual representations of those peers, except that one Patachitra that you have seen of a man sitting on a tiger. But otherwise, you don't. Even though across Southeast Asia, you have references to men with tigers. And so this tiger, with this holy man is very different from the tiger you see in Chinese imagination in other parts of China. Where, as I said, it is paired with the dragon, as you see on the left here, the tiger and the dragon used for rainmaking together. This is a tiger from the 15th century from Central Asia or Iran, and more representations of tigers for various reasons. But basically, I'd like to find links between men who have been controlling tigers in South Asia with those in Southeast Asia. So these are some of the pieces that I have written directly or indirectly on the Sundarban and how I understand tigers. Everything is on academia.edu in case you're interested. And I also wanted to briefly talk about this project that I started with a few friends and colleagues, Mathieu Kay, Arati Sridhar, Marina Aldada, Vinod Saranathan. So we were all involved in how to rethink the Asian non-human, and we asked various artists from all across Asia to contribute something in relation to the non-human from their culture. And so we had artists from all over, and you can go and take a look at this on our website called The Asian Bestiary. And so we had Naiza Khan and Hotsunyen, and I would urge you to look at work by both of them, but especially Hotsunyen if you're interested in the tiger in Southeast Asia, because he looks at the history of colonialism and the tiger in that part, and does very interesting things that you can watch online with the figure of the tiger. So this was one of the things that so what I mean to say is that the way in which people in the Sundarban explained tigers and the way they talked about it got me a lot more interested in how people think of these animals, and whether, such thinking can bring us perhaps advice, suggestions, inspirations on how to protect these animals, how to conserve them, how to cohabit with wild spaces and wildlife. So I think this is how I see it tying up to 50 years of Project Tiger and the work you've been doing on conservation and on how to rethink the animal. So This is an image from the website, and I would like to thank all of you. I hope I have not gone above time. Good. It will give us perhaps more time to for questions and answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anu. That was absolutely fascinating. And no, you did not go over time. It was perfectly within the time frame, and grateful to you for that as well. Now, I would like to invite Meghna Mehta to present her paper, and we'll have the response by Dominic Oki afterwards, along with the Q&A.
Hi, can you see my screen, Anu?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much, Dominic, Susan, and Anu, for bringing us all together and for giving this space to critically reflect on Project Tiger. And thank you very much, Anu, for setting the stage. I must say that, I mean, I owe, it's really not an exaggeration if I were to say that I owe my research interests in the Sundarbans and the region very much to Anu and her work. It's really an honor always to speak alongside her. I'm constantly learning from her work. And so thank you for, providing this backdrop that you did, and also sharing a little bit about your more recent ongoing project of tracing these linkages. So I'm going to just begin by very briefly sharing what my broader research interests are, and then I'll go into the specifics of this paper. So I'm interested in thinking about the idea of how one can conserve life projects of residents in the Sundarbans. So how we can go beyond just conserving biodiversity, but conserving aspirations and wider notions of well-being. And then, just as Anu has, sketched out, and very much drawing from her work and from Forest of Tigers, her brilliant book, which inspired me and, a whole generation of scholars working on the Sundarbans. I'm interested in thinking about human and non-human sovereignty. So what does governance look like beyond the state? So very much, Bon Bibi, Dokhin Re, Ghazi, how does one think about ethics and everyday forms of governance in a forest of tigers? And then my interest is very much to locate from the kind of local political and moral economy of the Sundarbans ideas of consumption and overconsumption. So even as Anu was mentioning, ideas of need and greed kept resurfacing. It was a very common trope amongst people, lobe and obhav, or necessity, and doing some work, or what does it mean to be greedy? So I became interested in notions of sufficiency. I initially thought I was interested in notions of the good life, and then it actually became something around what does it mean to lead a life which is enough, or quote unquote sufficient. And then the last sort of framework that I'm really interested in is to go beyond what is sometimes seen as this thing that characterizes the conflict, not just in the Sundarbans, but in national parks across the world, which is the tiger versus people, or tiger versus tribal in India. Even though as we know in the Sundarbans, it's not tribal or indigenous or Adivasi only. But what is that sort of relationship do? What does this antagonism do, and how can we go beyond this antagonism to actually figure out what these counterintuitive alliances and hostilities might be? And the last interest I have in this area is, how does one conceive of climate change as an event for those who are suffering more mundane disasters and ordinary vulnerabilities which have been long standing? So it's thinking around ordinary crises. But very specifically on today's theme and paper, I'm going to go through about 4 examples, and there are many, what I'm sort of facetiously calling kind of human sacrifice at the temple of Project Tiger, but really in some ways it is how mainstream conservation is a negation sometimes of both human and non-human life. And I want to give you 3 or 4 examples. I mean, let's see how much I can get through of just the ways in which at the village level, at the local level, at daily ordinary life, how mainstream conservation ends up negating, sort of doesn't actually benefit people or the ecosystem. And that is what I mean about kind of negating both human and non-human life. So the first example is actually around, and then actually I will take you at the end to go beyond this kind of tiger versus human opposition and kind of elite versus poor idea that usually characterizes the conflict in the region. And I want to go beyond that to somewhat say, what are the actual antagonisms at play in this region? What are the conflicts that are taking place? What are the unlikely friendships between state and society? And so how can we move beyond, say, this kind of false opposition? Because it isn't really a tiger versus human antagonism necessarily. So to begin with, I guess the first kind of case of quote unquote human sacrifice, and this is a history that everybody here on this group will be very, well aware of, which is that Project Tiger, of course, came alongside the Wildlife Protection Act. And the reason why I recount this history is because when people like Anne Wright, who, as many of you will know, recently passed away, and her husband Bob Wright, and Anne with other trustees, of course, met Indira Gandhi, and it culminated in Project Tiger. And the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 was a legal cornerstone. And Anne Wright's daughter Belinda Wright, also, as many of you will know, who founded the Wildlife Protection Society of India, an anti-poaching organization, has an office in the Sundarbans, where I spent a significant part of my time doing fieldwork, headquartered in Bali Island. And this was an office which began in 2001. And what I found really fascinating when I was doing fieldwork was that a lot of, and I should say that, individual histories of each of these islands in the Sundarbans are quite unique. So what might be the case on Bali is very different from, say, neighboring islands, whether it's Kumir Mari or Sajelia. So on Bali, I found out that the idea of shikar, or horin shikar, so it wasn't, there wasn't rampant tiger poaching, but there were people who were killing deer, and that was eaten at weddings, and it was and deer here, spotted deer or cheetal. And of course, as the Wildlife Protection Act converted hunting or shikar into poaching, at the village level, what happened was that the people who were shikaris on Bali were people who had large land holdings. So they lived under the threat of raids from rivers, bandits, pirates, and dacoits, and landed families, anything from 15, 20 bighas and above, and this is not a huge amount of land, of course, if you compare Punjab and things, but in the Sundarbans, everybody has very small land holdings. And so even a kind of comparatively larger land holdings had licensed guns. And these were the men who went on shikar and for recreation and pleasure, and they would and on Bali Island, actually, they owned guns, and a lot of others went with them just to enjoy it and to kind of get a portion of the kill and of the meat. And those were sort of landless men and women who, not women actually, sorry, just men. And while I was in the field, I noticed that a lot of the people who had poaching cases against them, had been in jail for 3 years or over, had, fines that they had to pay, were embroiled in court cases, were not the owners of the guns and the ones who had, been going for shikar, but these others who would accompany them, to row the boat, to stand as a guard, to kind of, skin the carcass. And so anti-poaching organizations and the forest department's drive to basically stop what overnight became hunting into poaching ended up putting several very poor people behind bars. And I had no idea that, in fact, I mean, until of course this particular history was fascinating to me, where those people with then guns were people who were landed and who therefore became a part of the tourism industry and now have lodges, and then kind of now conservationists. So it was just this interesting case of overlaps that I found at the level of the village. And I want to, sort of go to my second point of this sort of what I'm calling human sacrifice, which is the ways in which this livelihood was made illegal for people whose homes were just across from this forest. And one of the tools of harassment is very much something called the boat license certificate, and it's a colonial certificate, and actually the measurement, it was a certificate of registration and measurement of boats called the BLC, and it's still in operation today. And in fact, you're seeing the older one on the left, and the right side is a kind of new contemporary BLC certificate. Even the contemporary one has mounds in kind of capacity, which is a unit of measurement which has been completely outdated. So people, fishermen have to rent these licenses from owners who are either in small towns like Canning, and they have to rent them. And the sort of going rate now is about 60,000. When I was in the field, it was about 35,000. So it's almost doubled per fishing season. And they're meant to be owned by original fishermen, but actually these licenses are hired, and it's the first kind of step into a deep vortex of debt for most fishing communities. And these BLCs have been actually historically when they began, it's unclear. It's said, when I tried to trace it, they said it's the Khulna office, and the papers aren't there, but as of 1923 is when these BLCs were given out, and they haven't been really renewed. And so some of these sort of ways in which the forest department and a national park is still governed by colonial licenses after a century of changes. And we see the changes that are rapid in this area in so many other ways, and in a second I'll walk you through those changes. But this is one of the aspects, which is how Project Tiger is so deeply depoliticized. So in some ways, the kind of really boring work of licenses, of how a fishermen have to navigate the bureaucracy and paperwork of fines, is something that no conservation NGO wants to take up. The forest department doesn't want to take up. It's too politically contentious. And so really what has happened is that illegality has been incorporated. Everybody is always trespassing. So you are, as somebody fishing in the Sundarbans forest, even though you're allowed to go into the buffer legally with a BLC, the buffer was too far away from most of the people that lived on Bali Island where I was conducting fieldwork, since they went across from their homes, and that was illegal, and they were trespassing. And so there's this very sort of public secret of illegally being allowed to go, and then there's fining, and there's a kind of official you're an offender and an aparadhi in this criminal database, where now rangers have these e-patrolling apps. So this system kind of relies on a public secret of trespassing. And of course, one has to remember that this is the same riverways where, in fact, you have luxury cruisers operating, you have tourist boats operating, and they have their passes, they have, there isn't restrictions, for example, in ship vessels, which are only increasing in quantity, that are carrying a very highly toxic fly ash from the port of Kolkata to the port of Bangladesh. And the third case is something that I've very recently gotten quite actively involved in with two lawyers as well in the High Court in Calcutta, and which is that, as we know, and as Anu said, this tiger in the Sundarbans attacks humans, and the majority, the core in the sanctuary, is officially out of bounds, as I've just explained. And so a lot of the deaths in this forest cannot officially exist. So there is no tally, really no official tally, which is actually accurate of the number of deaths by tigers, but also by sharks and crocodiles. And I'm just, there are many kind of speculations and many numbers that are thrown around, but, even within the forest department in the 1990s, from Kalyan Chakravarti in his book writes that it was approximately 36 deaths annually. Unofficial numbers might have gone to 100 deaths. Now, the numbers are not close to 100 even at this moment, of course. But the point is, we do not know the numbers officially. So, and this is, there are NGOs, there are activists, there are rights groups that are trying to tally. There are unions who try and tally numbers. I work with 2 litigators who have been trying to file a case for some of the victims of deaths by tigers to get their compensation. And so this, feels like a really dark kind of human sacrifice of the Project Tiger, which is that there's a very complicated apparatus where these deaths are discounted. The death certificates aren't issued. Police stations turn a blind eye. There's no paper trail. Often of somebody who's died. So rangers will go off trying to chase, a body if they come to hear of an accident in the forest, but there'll be no kind of written trail. And there's a lot of fear because you're trespassing constantly. And this is within the context where simultaneously there are really state-of-the-art sort of military-grade surveillance technologies where drones are being tried out and e-patrolling apps and camera traps, as we know, are being used. And we don't have the EI, artificial intelligence cameras in the Sundarbans yet, but as we know, there's been radio collaring, there was pug mark census, now there's camera traps, there's the M stripes that's kind of being rolled out in all of these parks. So in some ways, this is not a forest where it's always stayed in a kind of, the 17th, 18th century. It has moved to the 21st century when it comes to counting tigers. And, of course, Narendra Modi will announce every year the kind of tiger census data that comes out. And with great pride, that is something we know exactly. Actually, in fact, there are 96 adult tigers and more cubs. We don't know the cubs because the camera traps don't account for the cubs. But we don't know how many people have died by tiger attacks. So, Project Tiger in the Sundarbans has this legacy alongside a lot of surveillance. There's the BSF right there. There's national security interests. And I think one of the demands of the residents is that they are owed a compensation, which is a significant amount. It's 5 lakhs. Many have actually have a fisheries card. Many have a kind of they're enrolled in a life insurance scheme, so they actually should get 1 lakh more as well, above and beyond the 5 lakhs by the forest department. And then they have a fisherman's ID card, some of them, and so they would be eligible to 7 lakhs. But countless households have not received any compensation. And so this is the kind of court case that's ongoing in the Kolkata High Court. And of course, people, will always constantly say it's not the tiger that's killing us. It is the fear of being caught by the forester that is pushing us into the mouth of the tiger. But I think I just, want to dwell on this idea of compensation for a moment, because this is quite recent. This is a photograph from July where a group of about 70 to 80 women had assembled, all of whom, they've across different generations actually, would come together to attend a legal clinic that my friends Otin and Shantanu were giving, who are the lawyers. And on speaking with all of them, they had one demand. They said, our enmity or shatruta isn't increasing with the tiger. It is that we just want our lives, the husbands or sons or brothers, whatever family member that has been lost, their lives to be counted and tallied, and that we want to receive the compensation amount that's been stipulated. So this is something that, in a shared space, in a shrinking habitat, to think about what forms of not conflict or conviviality, but what might be forms of compromise. And within that, 5 lakh rupees, when Project Tiger can pay for huge investment, as we know, in counting the tigers. So this is something, is a kind of one of the sort of human sacrifices in perpetuating Project Tiger as something. And the last one I want to touch on specifically, because the Sundarbans is of course, also because it's in a delta which is facing erosion. And as everybody knows, it has had cyclones, repeated cyclones, both endemic historically, so not only since 2007. We know these will increase in intensity and become more erratic, but the Bengal Delta has been infamous for its cyclones. But what this extreme kind of climate crisis and biodiversity loss crisis has led to is a kind of extremist protectionist agenda. So either half the earth should be reserved for nature, and then either these quote unquote vulnerable coastlines should be depopulated of human residents. This, I should say, is a photograph taken by Subimal Bera. So I didn't take this photograph, and this is in the aftermath of in 2021, there was a cyclone Yas. And so what I want to say is a kind of last sort of negation of human life and life worlds is this idea, which is taking a lot of, in policy, technocratic policy circles, taking a lot of space, is this idea of retreating residents. And environmental economists and members of WWF and think tanks like ORF are discussing, again, the ways in which ecosystem services will a kind of cost-benefit analysis, and a way in which the Sundarbans in the future, once residents are depopulated, can be enmeshed into the carbon credits market. Mangroves can be grown, and then corporates can be offset off. So this is again, one of the latest iteration of a kind of negation of both human life and, I would say, life worlds and cosmologies that come alongside. And I want to briefly just show these two images, which is these were mud embankments, and recently they've been converted into not recently, in the past sort of decade and more, they've been converted into stronger concrete embankments, and then in the past, this is again on Bali Island, after Cyclone Amphan, these concrete slabs had broken, and these are much harder to repair. And so in some ways, this kind of politics of both what it means to live in this this ecology where interventions for human life and non-human flourishing are both either they are, and again, in terms of embankments, I think it's a very complicated question, and it's beyond the purview of this discussion for me to go, but I just wanted to show these images. But I want to very quickly move on that while I've sort of said there's a kind of tiger versus human opposition with which this area is understood, there are ways, as we all know, that there are fractions within fishing boats and within households. Often these fractions are caused because of the wildlife protection laws, because there are fishing boats that have passes, or they're bepashi nokas, or they're boats that have the BLC, the license, and others that don't, that they go illegally or churi kore. So there's a sense of politics and conflict and infighting within fishing boats. There's also some of my research, I had access to patrol with rangers. And so it was a very interesting relationship between fishing communities and rangers of the kind of lowest rung of the forest department. And it wasn't as antagonistic as I thought it was going to be. There's a kind of intimacy in their antagonism. And lastly, there was a lot of infighting and ideological differences in what one thinks are the same camp. So fishers' unions and rights activists often did not get along at all. So, actually in doing sort of fieldwork, one realizes the opposition isn't so much the tiger versus the human, but there are different fault lines at play at the level of the village and at the level of conservation organizations. And, these are some images of just patrolling with the forest rangers as they're being fined, and the kind of conflict of envy and jealousy with forest rangers, but also with other fishing boats, and of course the kind of conviviality and mutual sharing of food often that took place on these patrols with fishing boat that the rangers would find but then share a meal with. And of course, rangers themselves, as Sudha Vasan has shown in her work in Himachal, is that this is a job that they're doing. They didn't make the laws, but they realize that the fishers don't have no alternative, and sometimes they won't find them, but they are aware too that the sahibs are watching their every move. And so again, this is a crab collector who says if you have a good relationship over time, the rangers aren't going to suddenly confiscate your nets and ask you to leave. Imagine if I just asked you to leave my house today. You are not a stranger. I can't do that. Sometimes they'll say, don't come next week. The bosses are coming on a tour. And if we still don't listen to them, then they will fine us. Ultimately, it all depends on social relationships. So the rangers, and so I guess, this was a kind of antagonism that I realized had some intimacy that wasn't necessarily just a kind of hostile relationship. Similarly, I found this, I will skip over. Anu has gone over the kind of mitigation strategies. But similarly, I found that the rights activists and the fishers' unions had deep ideological differences. Often the fishers' unions' heads were the ones who also had BLCs in their own name and would rent them out to fishers. So it was kind of this contradiction in itself. So I lastly just want to go over very quickly the kind of two mantras of the region that are often peddled. One is ecotourism and one is alternative livelihoods. This is in my field site on Bali Island, a luxury resort which was built with the support of the Pradhan of Bali, and it had 58 cottages. This is while it was being built. With interconnecting villages. It had cut a huge swath of mangroves. This is the area in red there, that all the mangroves had been cut to make this resort. As it happened, the Green Tribunal placed orders to stop this construction through the help of environmental litigation that took place. And I do want to say that, here is Shankar Da, who says, he was really disappointed when this lodge was shut down, because for him, he thought this was going to be the best opportunity for work and livelihoods for his kids. And yet, of course, as research has done, plenty of other people, have argued for the way that this eco is not, it's this often seen as a catch call solution to the complex problems. And this is Rosaline Duffy here I'm quoting. But often it is, as we were discussing previously in the first session, I think in Revati's talk, which is that you sort of buy nature to save nature. And obviously luxury cruise ships are definitely not providing local livelihoods. And again, just to end, I will say, I think I have a minute or two left. I want to really, as Anu set the stage for this, Project Tiger in mainstream conservation usually ignore all alternative political vocabularies. And so as Anu's writings have shown, this area has been influenced by, 12th century Sufi Islam, different kinds of saints, peers, fakirs. There's been Buddhist influence. There's been all kinds of, Vaishnav Bhakti influence. There are global resonances of thinking about Bon Bibi's abode, or the common storehouse of Bon Bibi as a commons, and rules for managing common property, and this idea of taking only what you need from the forest and taking restraint. And so really following from and building on the work of Anu and other academics, but also Tony Stewart's really wonderful translations of the mythology and folk literature from this region. These ideas are something that I'm interested in looking at as expanding forms of governance. So how can we think of Bon Bibi as having territorial sovereignty over the forest, as genuinely having a way in which we can think of rules of the jungle or Jongler Niyam and its do's and don'ts as a source of governance. And this is very much alive. So this is village jatra, this village theater, and festivals and pujos. Just the future vision for a Project Tiger and future visions of conservation is to not think of conservation just as conjuring the Wildlife Protection Act or the regime of BLCs or Project Tiger and WWF, but could rules of the jungle, could Boondi be not be considered as a form of conservation? And it's not only again about conserving the species tiger, but about conserving the tiger demon too. And so I want to end, and this is my last slide, and this is a sort of plea amongst women who are victims, whose households are victims of tiger attacks, because this is 50 years of Project Tiger. And with the two collaborators, Shantanu Chakrabarti and Otindra Chakrabarti, they're litigators, and they've been fighting a case in the Kolkata High Court for the compensation of for the deaths of death due to wild animals. And the hope is that academic scholars, activists can really highlight this, because as many people are celebrating Project Tiger, this is a kind of human sacrifice of and imagine if it was I don't know, Swedish or US or I don't know, even elite Delhi, Calcutta people who were dying at the hands of the tiger. This would make national headlines daily. So I think this is something that these women that I was with in July and others we'd spoken about, that maybe in the 50 years of Project Tiger, one thing could be to have a kind of movement to think about compensation as a form of compromise in the shared space. And I'll end with that. Thank you. And sorry for going 1 minute over.
Thank you so much, Meghna. That was indeed very rich. And now over to you, Dominic, to respond to the two papers we heard today.
Yeah, thank you, both Anu and Meghna, for two absolutely fantastic papers. And my head is all over the place after those two papers, trying to really think about these two very rich papers and see, it's quite intuitive how they are not just topically linked, but in many ways thematically kind of mutually complementing each other. At the same time, there are also some moments and threads in the papers which do, if not go against each other, then at least have some sort of, I think, generative juxtaposition. And I think for the interest of ensuring that we get a conversation going, I think I'm going to keep my comments and questions very, very brief, so that we can open it out. And I hope that kind of what I can do, instead of talking to your papers individually, I think what I'll do is I'll just try and ask a very broad strokes question that maybe both of you in turn can respond to. And I think that what really comes out to me from both papers is what we might call a kind of reparative turn, by which I mean that the conference that we're engaging in here, Anu, Susan, and I has got this tripartite title or subtitle, right? Conservation, conflict, and critique. And so, what you'll see from that, and what you'll get from that, is obviously this sense that we have a deliberate kind of conflict within our own framing of the conference, right? So on the one hand, there's this 50 years of Project Tiger, this idea that in order, in a sense, to speak to people immediately, to grab attention and to get people interested in this, there has to be at least an acknowledgement of a milestone, an acknowledgement of an anniversary, and a flirtation even with a kind of celebratory tone, right? However, the subtitle, we hope, indicates that what we're doing here is not just celebratory, not just boosterism, but it's instead grappling with the cold, hard realities and historicizing this 50 years to try and think about what happened and what comes next. And so this is what takes me to what I feel like both papers are pointing towards, which is we have conflict, we have critique in both papers. However, what you both do in different ways is try in some sense to offer a reparative vision, or at least some kind of reconciliatory approach to human-tiger relations. Anu, in your paper, you really kind of frame things first through your own experience and through your teachings via Descalar, through animism. And then in Meghna's paper, we get this sense of, okay, here's all the critique. Here are the 4 ways that that humans are sacrificed for the conservation regime. And yet, what about all of these countervailing motifs, moments, very localized moments in which relationships which we tend to think, if we're wanting to subscribe to a purely critical approach, we might miss out on. So the ways in which forest guards and fishers might share a lunch together. And so both papers kind of open out onto what might come next, or what is already happening within these systems which are built so that these relationships are in some way stymied, right? That impede these relationships. However, what happens is you have uneven application. You have these strange moments when the system isn't quite totalizing, isn't quite homogenizing, and people find ways to resist or just go on in another way. So that's me prefacing my question to both of you, which is basically, it seems that animism then in some way actually is informing both papers, because in Anu's case, we have this sense of, okay, we need to have a perspectival shift away from the kind of secularizing or rationalizing force of conservation, which has a naturalistic approach to human-animal relations. We have to instead embrace a kind of animistic view of what it means to be a human or a being in the world of other beings. And in Meghna's case, there is also a kind of animistic side, in that it seems that what Meghna's argument is suggesting in some way is that, in fact, animism, or some kind of animistic thinking, is actually built into the rationality of conservation, because as the framing that Meghna has here is that we have human sacrifice, right, at the temple of Project Tiger, in which case there's some kind of implication here that there's a kind of psychic or spiritual purging, that the supposedly rational, supposedly scientific, supposedly biological and zoological domain and discipline of conservation biology, of the application in the program of Project Tiger, that these supposedly rational ideas, in fact, are built in with all of these kinds of kind of animistic or spiritual ideas, right? A sacrifice of humans for the saving, of tigers. So my question to you both then is, what for you do you perceive to be the advantages? I feel like this is the bit that's clear from your papers, the kind of advantages of a kind of animistic perspectival shift. But really what I'm interested in is, what are the risks of taking a kind of critical approach that uses animism, a critical approach that adopts a perspectival shift in order to think through these things, which I think those advantages are there, but you can tell me more if you'd like. But I am really interested to hear about what might be the limits, the risks of a kind of animistic thought. So yeah, maybe we start with Anu.
Hi, Dominic. Thanks for this question. That is very difficult to think with. What might be the limits of animism? I think animism works in small groups, within a group that knows about it and that is convinced about it and that treats other people with the same kind of, understanding. I don't think animism would work outside, or would work with people even, 3 islands away from Shajelia or Bali Island, because you have the hierarchies of caste that make it impossible to view non-humans in the same light. For example, a cow is not seen in the same way as a buffalo, even though 75% of India's milk comes from buffaloes, and buffaloes are not protected animals in the way cows are. So I think it works in places where people have this kind of pretty non-hierarchical understanding of each other too. And this is something that had surprised me when I had been to the Sundarbans. Most people in the island where I did fieldwork, for example, were from scheduled caste backgrounds. So the thing is, it works when in a small group, but how do you try and get this across to, let's say, a forest official that has come from Delhi, that is very, very ensconced in ideas of hierarchy, ideas of these are all superstitious people that don't understand anything, and they refuse to bow down to our conservation efforts. When so for me it's just two different languages. And I was glad I was initiated into that language of the islanders, the way Meghna has been. And, both of us share a sort of understanding of the Sundarban, which is deeply ensconced within the regions, the people's understanding of it. And this is why Meghna's work is so interesting and relevant today, when she, but to what extent it can be helpful, for example, for tiger widows to be getting their compensation. I don't know, because here you're talking of rights, but for the Indian state, we are all equal citizens. However, we know that that is not how things function, right? How it is so much more difficult for somebody without connections or money to be getting any kind of official paper, or to try and get their rights, their what through the constitution they are supposed to get. So this is why I for me, it was just a way of talking about how people there saw non-humans. But within the wider world, I would prefer the language of rights to be used, as opposed to the language of animism, because it can be another form of exploitation when it shouldn't be. But anyway, that's how I see it. I don't know if I got your very interesting question correctly, but yeah, that's how.
That is absolutely a really fantastic response, right? Because this is one of the big questions. Must it always be localized? Can it be scaled up? Should it be scaled up? What's kind of going to be left behind once scale comes into the mix? And I think you pointed that out really, really well. Meghna, I wonder what your thoughts are.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you, Anu. It's a question I'm really interested in, and actually I have two answers to it. And one is that I think there can be animism that can also be quite violent. So if we have a broad definition of animism, if it's just a way in which one attributes the Hindu state, for example, might think of itself as deeply animistic, and often, sacred landscapes like the Brahmaputra or the cow, as Anu mentioned right now, it's a very different animism from the kind that Anu has written about, and the ways in which both of us are thinking alongside residents of the Sundarbans vis-a-vis their relations to the forest. Having said that, so there can be both care within animism as well as violence. Even within the Sundarbans, I think the rules of the jungle, or jungler niyam, and this idea of the Bon Bibi's a sort of common storehouse, I think of it as a parable of ways in which one can actually learn from and understand a different metaphysics of relating to the human and the non-human. But even those have constraining possibilities. So I think even those can be restrictive for women. Some of these rules were restrictive for women. There were lots of do's and don'ts for them, much more so while the men were in the forest, especially collecting honey. They weren't allowed to go into the market, and they were also adapting it, changing it. But at the same time, I would say, I want to also link this idea that we don't have to take it necessarily literally, but we can learn something. And one of the books that I'm really inspired by is Julie Livingston's Self-Devouring Growth. And she talks about the metaphysics that was necessary for rain-making rituals. And she says, everybody had to come together. the human and non-human, the chiefs had to bring rains with this act of unison. And now rainmaking is through, irrigation and ways of, the government supplies water, and it's a different kind of politics of thinking about, again, rights versus a kind of chief asking for the community, and various like ritual specialists coming together to create rain. Very briefly, I will touch on the idea of rights, which is to say, would it be possible for the rights discourse, and this is something that I'm interested in and would love Anu's thoughts on it, in fact, is that, like in Odisha, for example, the Dongria Corn case was, Niyamgiri, mining around Niyamgiri was stopped with the idea that actually it was a sacred mountain. So legal jurisprudence took the idea that in fact, because of its sacred nature, Vedanta wasn't allowed to continue mining. So is there a possibility actually for a lexicon of justice where rights can incorporate somewhere? I don't know. I mean, this is an open-ended question. It's something I think about, that rights can incorporate potentially this idea of, of a common storehouse, of the rules that around which the forest usage is and this is, changing very quickly and very rapidly. The rules are also eroding as they would, because of the forces of market and state around people in the Sundarbans. But I suppose it's an open-ended idea of the possibilities of care with animistic thinking, not literally, but maybe as a parable for, co-living. Yeah, thank you.
So we'll be taking questions from the audience now. I see that Susan has her hand raised. Susan, would you like to go first? And in the meantime, if there are others who have questions, please let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Anu. I had a question each for Anu and Meghna. My question for Anu was, I was really struck when you said that I think about animism, that it can also tell us about the humans themselves. So I was wondering about what it is that we can learn about these humans, if those insights would be ontological, or if we can even extrapolate their socioeconomic histories of some sort. And if that is possible, then my question is connected to the earlier discussion about rights as well. If we are going to attribute some kind of different ontological relationship with non-humans, then would we be imposing a discourse of rights and justice if we are going to talk about that? My question for Meghna is about compensation. And I just wanted to know more about the process itself, because in Kerala, the forest offices, the main services they provide is with regards to compensation. And so I wanted to know how that works in Sundarbans, and if the agitation is only with regards to human deaths, and because that is paramount with regards to concerns, or if people also agitate if they're not adequately compensated for cattle loss. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. That was such a good question. I've often been wondering about it, and I feel that with the whole discourse around global warming, we are increasingly talking about a shared ontology, right? Both a shared ontology that very, very often resembles what animism is, where we need to think of the existence and continuation of the plant and animal world for our own continuation, right? And so I feel that increasingly something that didn't exist 25 years ago today has come into the language in relation to global warming, which is that, we can't really save ourselves without saving the rest of the, without saving the bees, without saving certain insects. So interestingly for me, it was in the Sundarban that I heard it first. People kept saying, we need to, tigers need to exist because it's only because we have tigers here that we have forests. And if we didn't have forests here, the cyclones would be just terrible. And once when the tsunami happened, it was low tide in the Sundarban and they were not affected, but they still saw a huge wall of water coming. And a lot of people said, we were saved because of the forest. So there is this conviction that, they need to protect tigers because they need to have the forest there. And so it's an ontology which I feel increasingly we are starting to share. And in relation to also, how we treat other people, a lot of countries have realized that if, places in India and Bangladesh isn't saved from global warming, they aren't safe from, migration and hordes of migrants coming over and settling. So a lot of the discourse around global warming is also around migration. And then how do we deal with, so I feel that there is an incorporation of this kind of ideology, ontology, in today's understanding of the planet and how we should live within it if we are to continue existing within it. I don't know if that makes sense, but I kind of see that. And the language of rights and justice very much fits in it, right? Because it's not because you have a lot of money that you will be protected from climate change. You will to a certain extent in the beginning, but in the end, you'll die like everybody else because the planet will have, disintegrated, right? So, like, do I make sense in relation to this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. It's a good question.
Sorry, Susan, I actually missed the last line of your question because I was, I had cut out for a moment. Can I ask you to repeat? I heard the beginning that it was about compensation, but I didn't hear you finish the question. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I just wanted to know about the process and how that works, and if people agitate for compensation only when humans are killed, or if cattle loss is also not adequately compensated.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. So actually, in the context of the Sundarbans, most of these deaths, in fact, the majority, I mean, all of them really, there used to be tiger straying much more. And I think at the time when Anu was doing her fieldwork, especially in Sajelia, I think, there was now there are nylon fences which have helped actually. It seems they've also kind of created a hassle because the fishermen have to cut holes sometimes in these fences to get into the creeks. But basically all the deaths are not in the village itself but in the forest. So this is not there's a kind of the inhabited islands, and then there's forested islands and sandbanks and sort of with mangroves. So the deaths are within what are quote unquote, illegal trespassing, out of bounds areas. And the Wildlife Protection Act stipulates that this is compensation for the death caused by a wild animal. It does not stipulate legal, illegal. But of course, the Forest Department has deemed you're not supposed to be there in the first place. So there will be no compensation. And so it's hidden and it's not tallied. And there's a very strong kind of consensus from all of the bureaucratic rungs. So the police thana does not take your general diary, and there's no paper trail left. So there's no death certificate given. And often people, they're running around from one office to the other in a kind of classic sort of relationship to the paperwork of bureaucracy to try and get this compensation. In terms of the agitation, it's not such a it isn't it is a very large, it's actually so unclear how many households. I mean, really, if there were to be a serious survey, every 10th household in the Sundarbans, I would say there's some family member who has suffered this, and it's really pervasive. As an ethnographer, I say this anecdotally. I've not done the survey myself, but unions have, activist groups have, but the Sundarbans is a large region, so I think it's quite and it is hard and distressing. This meeting, the image that I showed you all in July, I mean, there were women who were like, I would say above 80, walking, like they sort of traversed 2 islands, left 5 a.m. in the morning to show up for this legal training, to say that it's been 30 years since our husband died, and we're still like, we want compensation. And it was really heart-wrenching to see. I mean, some of them were as recent, the death was last year. And actually, just this is something that is just really hidden, and it should not be. I don't think anybody, the fear, I should just say, is that in other contexts of the Indian subcontinent, but elsewhere, if there's a man-eater, quote unquote, it's thought of as deviant. And like in Nainika Mathur's work, if there's a crooked cat, there will be a bureaucracy, maybe slow, but the idea is that you catch the leopard and you sort of take it away so that humans aren't attacked repeatedly by this deviant aberration of a man-eating bug. But here, it's there's no question, obviously, of euthanasia or relocation, and not as if residents want that. It isn't creating enmity in that sense. They're like, we're very aware of the risk. And so it's not so much for cattle, it's for human lives. And this is something, I mean, I hope as a collective of Project Tiger for 50 years is quote unquote celebration, there can be just a more like a deeper acknowledgement that people are dying at the mouth of a tiger, and actually the humane response would be to just provide them 5 lakh rupee compensation. And so yeah, that's sort of where I just want to repeat that it is with 2 other lawyers in Kolkata that have been working, and the very few environmental lawyers who want to fight for tiger widows. It's not much money in that kind of work. So there's a PIL ongoing. They've just had a writ petition. They keep getting rejected, but it's an ongoing case in the High Court to get compensation for these widows. Yeah.
I think Mahesh had a question. Would you like to go ahead?
Yes, please. Thank you. So my question is to Meghna. It's actually a very simple one. There's obviously enormous distress, human suffering in the areas of the Sundarbans, both within and adjacent to the tiger reserve, whether in terms of loss of human life, or loss of amenity, or loss of means of livelihood, confiscation of a port. So West Bengal is one of the politically very significant states in India. And Sundarbans in the 40s to 60s had a history of a lot of agrarian unrest, very important armed rising in Kakadwi. And these areas are very important politically today in the conflict of the 2 major political parties, CPM, BJP. In an earlier period, it was Left Front Congress. Trinamool BJP now and Left Front Congress. So I just wondered whether there are political parties at all engaged in this issue. I'm not referring to the one in power, because I assume that party's policies work through the state bureaucracy, Left Front earlier, Trinamool today. How do these issues play out in terms of politics? Well, particularly because West Bengal has very keenly contested elections, even at the panchayat level. It's one of the very active panchayat political conditions in it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a brilliant question, and I'm sure Anu will also have a very interesting response to it from what it was like at the time of your engagement over the years, Anu, but even when you were doing your original fieldwork. In my case, Mahesh, it's very much, I mean, the unions are extremely active and are definitely the Fishers Union, so the Dokkin Mongo Matsujivir Forum, the DMF, which is a part of the National Fish Workers Forum, have deputations. There are protests that take place. So, for example, there was a crab collecting ban after 4 men had died in the same month in January. I think this is 2016. 4 people had died because of a tiger attack, and the forest department panicked. And the next thing they did was they just banned crab collecting altogether. And this was the time that the crab prices were the highest. Because January is kind of Chinese New Year time, and they all exported to China, and so the unions rallied together, and the Fishers Union had a deputation at the Sajnakhali, the kind of forest department office there, and windows were broken. A ranger was attacked and hurt, and it was this intimate antagonism that I also write about between friendship between rangers and mutual care also gets completely disrupted, and there is political mobilization when it comes to unions fighting on behalf of fishers, even though they, I would say, are compromised themselves. So as I said, the head of the secretary of DMF in Bengal is somebody who owns 2 BLCs, or there are 2 BLCs in his name. So I'm not going to take his name, but I know him quite well, and he leases out BLCs and makes money of it, in rent-seeking behavior, while also fighting on behalf of these fishers' issues. Vis-a-vis, Mahesh, the Tiger Widows case, it doesn't seem like it's large enough a constituency politically, and there hasn't been enough mobilization. It's so spread out in the region. This meeting, which had about 70 women show up, or maybe there were 80 women show up. It took, months of people. The organizations are underfunded. Somebody has to go, call these women out to come. In a sense, there's deep distress, and, there is mental health, but also just financial distress when you're really running around from office to office trying to get compensation. So for you to go to these meetings to get a legal training with no guarantee of anything actually coming off it. So I don't think there's a political mobilization or a political constituency that's strong enough for the compensation issue. But a lot of other cases vis-a-vis the forest department, the TMC, I mean, previous governments, as of now, the TMC union leaders aligned with political parties in power are very much fighting on behalf of fishers when it comes to a political case, especially as we all know in lead up to elections, there'll be some big action that the union will do, and that will peter out after a few months. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. We have a question in the chat as well. If both speakers are willing to take up one more, because it is already past 5, I can read it out.
Yep. Yes.
Great. So this is a question from Angelos for both of you. He asks, while interviewing tiger widows in the Sundarbans, Bangladesh, we were asking them if they were seeking protection from born baby before their husband's departure. Most respondents said no. How do you explain that? Do you think that had to do with religion, Muslims?
Can I take it? Can I answer?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, please, Anu.
So I mentioned it briefly in my book. Actually, it depends on why you go into the forest and what you're going to get. So I had asked a very famous poacher if he had a huge, big, shrine to Bone Bibi. And he just answered very cynically saying, which government gave her the patta of the forest? And like the right over the forest. And then he had said, no, but Bone Bibi is good only for crab collectors and small fishers. She's not good for those who have rifles and go and hunt deer or go get wood or hunt tigers. So I worship Kali. I don't worship Bon Bibi. So this was a Hindu man. And in both places, actually, Bon Bibi was going out of fashion. I remember in 99, somebody joking and saying, you know, what are we doing worshipping a Muslim goddess? Okay. And in Bangladesh, also, even those who sort of offered flowers were not very keen to sort of say that they had done so, or that they were still maintaining the shrine of Bon Bibi. Or if they were saying, yeah, it's because my father did it, so I'm continuing, but actually I don't depend on the forest, and you know, that's it. So the first understanding is that you need her only if you are a small guy. If you're a big guy, if you're somebody who is going to go to the forest to take more than you should, you can't depend on her protection. So you don't. Secondly is both amongst Hindus and Muslims, she's getting out of fashion. Now, what happened was that with Amitav Ghosh's book, The Hungry Tide, and with people writing about Bon Bibi, the government in West Bengal has taken over, you know, her image, and there are Bon Bibi melas. And in Bangladesh also, there's a play on Bon Bibi, and she's become like this very trendy, cosmopolitan, people from the cities know about her. And so now she is placed in certain government bureaus in West Bengal, at least, but she wasn't 25 years back. It was Makali, you know, it was Kali who was there. So it has to do with religion, and also what I did some work in Bangladesh in a lot of the villages along the border, and a lot of the people who lived there had come from West Bengal and sort of were political refugees, and they were all trying to better their economic situation. And just like the Hindus who had from Bangladesh, who had, you know, or from East Pakistan, who had come to West Bengal, they were doing the same thing. So both groups were funding mosques and temples. So temples in West Bengal by the Hindu refugees, and this was my second work. And mosques were built by these people who had come over from the other side. It was as if, you know, to belong to this new nation, you really had to prove your religious identity and affiliations. And for that, you had to be seen building a mosque and a temple. So, and this is continuing today too. You see that even in people who are, you know, in the village where I did fieldwork, there's a third temple that has come up. From no temples, you know, 25 years back, or just little shrines. I'm not talking about the Bon Bibi shrines here. I'm talking about the Hori temple. There's a Makali temple, you know. So things are changing on both sides, politically speaking. So I can totally understand why they wouldn't be worshipping, you know, or venerating Bon Bibi or talking about her. I only found 3 shrines when I went in Bangladesh 12 years back, maintained by Muslims. Already then, you know, there were very few. So I'm not surprised.
Thank you so much, Anu. Meghna, would you like to add to that?
No, I think Anu is the expert on this. So yeah, just her response. I'm also learning.
Right. Thank you so much. And with that, we come to the end of this session. Thanks again, Anu and Meghna, for these absolutely brilliant papers, which have helped me at least, and I'm sure the others around, as much in understanding much better what's going on with Project Tiger. We will be continuing a few hours later at 7:30 p.m. in India, 2 p.m. if you're in the UK, with the 4th session of the symposium. And we look forward to seeing you there again. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
You.